Good morning, everyone. Thank you for visiting the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza today, and happy President's Day. We're very glad you could join us. My name is Stephen Fagin. I'm the curator here at the museum, and I'd like to welcome you to this gallery talk and artifact showcase that we're calling Pop Culture Camelot, an opportunity here to commemorate President's Day by bringing out some interesting examples of Kennedy pop culture. I'm doing this talk about President Kennedy, and my colleague Lindsay Richardson will be doing a talk at 2 o'clock this afternoon focusing on a completely different set of artifacts on Jacqueline Kennedy. So if you're able to, come back to that program this afternoon. It's going to be completely different and far better than this one. In a Gallup poll in November 2013, John F. Kennedy was rated our top modern president, with 74% of those surveyed rating him an outstanding or above average chief executive. Exactly 2 years ago, in an online President's Day poll, U.S. News & World Report confirmed these findings. Once again, John F. Kennedy was the most popular president in American history, modern American history, ranking almost equally high among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It's not really surprising. Going all the way back to Harry S. Truman in 1945, John F. Kennedy maintained the highest average approval rating of any modern president while in office, 70%. Quite a few books, articles, and documentaries have explored this apparently never-ending affection for President Kennedy, citing the Kennedy family's own exemplary branding, the trauma of the assassination instantly transforming this young leader into legend, or his historical position in the early 1960s, just prior to a turbulent decade of violence, social upheaval, and government mistrust. But in life, long before history dictated any narrative, John F. Kennedy was a vibrant and influential force in popular culture. There has been a somewhat circular evolution of his pop culture image as a candidate and president, as a martyr and memorial icon, and as a nostalgic embodiment of the early 1960s. It's a fascinating lens to view Kennedy today, more than 100 years after his birth and 56 years after his tragic death. In 1960, the Massachusetts senator tapped into something very special. With a camera-ready appearance and soaring rhetoric, he was perfectly positioned to be the first president born in the 20th century. He used television to great advantage, and he spoke of his vision for a peaceful future, an important outlook to have at the height of the Cold War. We see this represented in these 1960 political pens, his forward-thinking vision promising progress for all, which voters could interpret as economic progress or progress towards civil rights. He enjoyed broad appeal among the country's youth, who helped generate huge crowds at his campaign stops and electrified young first-time voters. And we see here examples of his inclusive outreach to different communities. Viva Kennedy clubs raised the profile of Mexican-American voters and delivered a pro-Kennedy message throughout the Southwest. This was aided by the first ever Spanish-language presidential campaign commercial featuring a direct appeal from Jackie Kennedy. One of the objects that we have out here on the table today is from the 1960 campaign, this hat. And there is a lot here to like. It's made of plastic, molded to look like a traditional straw hat, which I think is very emblematic of the early 1960s, and as plastics were becoming increasingly popular. The red, white, and blue ribbon includes stars identifying all 50 states. With the additions of Hawaii and Alaska, the 1960 election was the very first to include all 50 United States of America. And of course, in the front, directly above Kennedy for President, we have a little watercraft with a 60 emblazoned on the bow. This is a stylized PT-109, the motor patrol boat that Kennedy famously commanded as a lieutenant in the South Pacific during World War II. Here is a whole slew of these campaign hats in action at a stop in Columbus, Ohio in October 1960. The fact that PT-109 is not identified by name on the hat is simply because everyone pretty much knew the story of PT-109 by heart by the end of that 1960 campaign. While Vice President Richard Nixon relied upon his record of leadership and experience over the past 8 years under President Eisenhower, Senator Kennedy's supporters, which included all the survivors of the PT-109 sinking, touted his courage under fire and life-saving heroics. Here we see a PT-109 charm bracelet and tie clip. That tie clip proved so popular that a new version without the 60 was produced, and the president would personally distribute these to friends and supporters throughout his years in the White House. And what years they were. Media attention helped to personalize the White House like never before, and the entire Kennedy family became familiar faces in American living rooms. The pervasive pop culture presence of the Kennedys made them ripe for parody, and no parody was more ubiquitous than this 1962 record album, The First Family. Anchored by the Kennedy impersonation by entertainer Vaughn Meader, The First Family was a full-cast comedy album recorded in front of a live audience and released in November 1962. By today's standards, it's a very gentle satire, poking fun at the president's New England accent, the presence of children in the White House, and the public athleticism of the Kennedys, as well as other well-known aspects of the family and administration. This was a smash hit, selling 7.5 million copies and staying #1 on the Billboard 200 for 12 straight weeks, becoming the fastest-selling record in history up to that time. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year in 1963 and was followed by a sequel, The First Family Volume 2, in March of that year. A month after its release, Kennedy was asked about this record and other presidential parodies at a December press conference. Let me share with you the full question and answer response.
President, it's been a long time since a president and his family have been subjected to such a heavy barrage of teasing and fun-poking and satire. I mean, there have been books on backstairs at the White House, and cartoon books with clever sayings, and photo albums with balloons and the rest, and now a smash hit record. Can you tell us whether you read and listen to these things and whether they produce annoyment or enjoyment?
Annoyment. No, they produce. Yes, I have read them and listened to them. Actually, I listened to Mr. Meader's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me. But so he's annoyed.
President Kennedy distributed 100 copies of the First Family album as Christmas gifts in 1962, and he reportedly played the full record at a cabinet meeting. And Vaughn Meader was a Kennedy fan, as demonstrated by this telegram in which he promises that his recent impersonation on a CBS TV show was done, quote, with great affection and respect, quote, hoping that it met with the president's approval. A little less gentle was this parody board game, The Kennedys, created by two recent Harvard graduates who were both on the staff of the Harvard Lampoon Humor magazine. It's described as, quote, a game of intra-family power struggle, a highly successful exercise in satire that is also an ingeniously devised game of strategy. Well, last week I did try to give this a go, and I found the gameplay to be surprisingly complicated. I was either not smart enough or not patient enough to play through to the end, but I did make it to the end of the multi-page instruction booklet. The object of the game is to assume the role of a Kennedy family member and then triumph over one's relatives in a contest for national prominence. To do this, one had to collect a very specific combination of 6 essential components, which you can see here are personal image, social standing, position of importance, popular support, influential friends, and the backing of a power group. What is perhaps most interesting, or maybe even shocking by today's standards, is that you were able to play this game as either Caroline or John Jr., as well as President and Mrs. Kennedy, Robert and Ted Kennedy. We think of the taboo inclusion of family members, especially children, in political satire to be of recent invention, but no, it was very active back in the Kennedy years. In fact, down in our museum store today, you'll find a reprint of this best-selling 1962 satirical coloring book drawn by Mad Magazine illustrator Mort Drucker. It's an early example of a coloring book for grown-ups, although the satirical text is written from the perspective of 4-year-old Caroline Kennedy and proceeds to poke fun at the entire Kennedy family and administration. In these examples, the book comments on the cost of the First Lady's clothing and suggests political ambitions among the Kennedy children. Notice in the image on the right, there's a little PT-109 toy boat just outside John Jr.'s playpen. Speaking of children, let's talk for a moment about dolls. Specifically, this fine example from Kamar Inc. of Torrance, California, created by Palestinian immigrant Pascal Kamar and manufactured in Japan. This little set includes an 11-inch cloth and plastic doll holding a newspaper that could slowly rock back and forth in a wooden wind-up mechanical rocking chair. It played the tune "Happy Days Are Here Again." Priced at $6.95, or about $60 adjusted for inflation, this doll first became available in February 1963. President Kennedy received one at his White House birthday party on May 29, 1963. In fact, this doll was sent as a gift by Mr. Kamar himself, who also took the liberty of sending a doll to Kennedy's political rival, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Here's another image from that birthday celebration. I love how the doll and President Kennedy are striking almost identical rocking chair poses. Now, despite the smiles seen here, it seems that the president was not particularly fond of this somewhat creepy mechanical doll. White House Assistant Counsel Lee White complained about the doll to the Better Business Bureau, saying it was, quote, "a violation of the president's policy," end quote. Following the assassination, all remaining stock abruptly disappeared from store shelves, and the doll was never sold again. The components, however, were reused in interesting ways. The rocking chairs were repurposed for a line of Ma and Pa Kettle figures. Thousands of Kennedy heads and hands were removed from the dolls and discarded, while each business suit body received a new identity, that of the cartoon Playboy Rabbit. Strange but true. At the same time that this rocking chair doll was in stores, children could choose to dress up as President Kennedy for Halloween. This Mr. President costume was produced for the fall 1963 season by Ben Cooper Inc., the most prominent manufacturer of children's Halloween costumes in the United States at that time. Mr. President was on store shelves alongside Ben Cooper's other offerings, which included, at the time, Howdy Doody, Gumby, Bozo the Clown, George Jetson, and a wide range of Disney characters. The costume, consisting of a one-piece rayon suit and a glow-in-the-dark mask, available along with a similar one for Jackie Kennedy labeled First Lady, sold for just under $2, or around $17 adjusted for inflation. Ben Cooper costumes tended to be pricier options for parents, but as the packaging boasted, each costume was double-stitched for longer wear and treated to temporarily retard flame. 8-year-old David Sherman of Rochester, New York, was among those who dressed up as President Kennedy for Halloween in 1963. In an oral history with our museum, he remembered, "President Kennedy was only maybe 2 years older than my dad. It was a White House that was like our house." David refused to wear a jacket that Halloween night, even though the weather in Rochester was in the upper 30s. He said, "I got sick afterwards, but I went door to door as the president. I think people liked it. I think they laughed." There were several other styles of Kennedy masks on the market. Here's Caroline Kennedy wearing one alongside her father. Unfortunately, humorous moments like this would be seen as poignant, even painful, after November 22nd, 1963. The first family was pulled from record stores, and Von Meter's career was effectively over. Much like the rocking chair dolls, several thousand Mr. President Halloween costumes were destroyed by Ben Cooper Inc. following the assassination. And the late president's image in popular culture changed instantly and significantly to one of dignified memorialization. This is perhaps best seen through youth publications like this Memorial Weekly Reader from December 1963 and this Champion of Freedom comic book from 1964, an illustrated biography of President Kennedy that came with a portrait on the back cover that was suitable for framing. My favorite example is this 1964 Salute to Courage produced by DC Comics that was used to advertise the newly released John F. Kennedy Memorial postage stamp. In this short comic, the teacher asks students what they remember about President Kennedy. Young Tom reflects on the heroic PT 109 story, while little Betty says, "He wasn't a bully." Quoting the president, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." I see this as a wonderful example of legacy building, encouraging young people to not just remember the president, but to remember his qualities that made him admired around the world. In stark contrast to the First Family, several best-selling record albums were produced that collected highlights from Kennedy's speeches. This one, perhaps the most famous, was an album of the memorial broadcast made by radio station WMCA in New York the day after the assassination. Like the plethora of memorial albums and publications, busts of the late president, of varying degrees of quality, were very popular following the assassination. These are just a few examples that we have in our collection. Some of them are really quite interesting and look very little like President Kennedy. But it's admirable that individuals with seemingly minimal artistic skill tried in their own personal ways to respond to the assassination through sculpture. In fact, personal responses to the assassination varied widely around the world. This John F. Kennedy quilt was made in 1966 by professional quilter Ruth Buchanan in Whitesboro, Texas, about 70 miles north of Dallas. Shortly after the assassination, Ruth took to her lifelong craft to create a memorial tribute to President Kennedy, and it quickly became her best-selling quilt. She produced them exclusively for several years, and her last remaining example was donated to our museum in 2003. The following year, when it was briefly put on display, Ruth, then at the age of 87, made her very first trip outside of Whitesboro, traveling from the home where she was born in 1916 to see her quilt in a museum here in Dallas. On the opposite end of the spectrum, from individually crafted personal responses, we have mass-produced items like this memorial glass, which was sold at gas stations and souvenir shops across the United States. I find it interesting because it hits on all the major legacy points: the Kennedy image, the inaugural address, the rocking chair, the PT boat, and the eternal flame. This iconography that we still instantly recognize today was solidified in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. The memorial example that we have here on the table is this unique lamp. The impressive medallion was done by noted American sculptor Raffaello Menconi, who is today remembered as the sculptor of the presidents, because he crafted relief portraits of George Washington to Richard Nixon. This memorial medal for President Kennedy remains one of his most famous. We have another Menconi medal in our collection, this martyred president's portrait from 1965, showing Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy. Items collecting these men together were somewhat popular following the assassination, though just a few years later, they were dwarfed by memorials featuring this trinity of martyred American leaders. After the 1968 assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the memorial image of President Kennedy was swiftly added to create a trio of secular saints whose murders bookended the 60s experience, exemplifying the unnecessary violence and loss of this turbulent era. In popular culture, this was most apparent in the song Abraham, Martin, and John, first recorded by the singer Dion and released in August 1968. Although not a traditional pop song, it nevertheless reached number 4 on the US pop singles chart and was awarded a gold record for selling more than 1 million copies. The song was later interpreted by a variety of artists, including Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvin Gaye, Ray Charles, and Whitney Houston. The album cover shown here has John and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King added to Mount Rushmore alongside Abraham Lincoln. Juxtaposed with that satirical Mount Rushmore art from the Kennedys' board game just 6 years earlier, we get a stark visual example of how quickly the mood of the nation had shifted by the latter half of the 1960s. Many viewed the late president's death as a watershed moment that ushered in the decade's violence and skepticism, firmly establishing Kennedy's role as the iconic figure representative of the early 60s. In more recent years, the image of President Kennedy has somewhat circled back to the more lighthearted and occasionally satirical pop culture depictions seen prior to November 1963. Here we have a trio of modern examples: a bobblehead from 2001, a Pez dispenser from 2015, and a computer video game called Reelect Jfk from the mid-1990s. The video game is particularly interesting in that it imagines an alternate history in which President Kennedy was not assassinated in Dallas and runs for re-election in 1964. According to the gameplay, you assume the role of JFK and make decisions on the critical issues of 1964, civil rights, Vietnam, and other events. You have the dual task of getting re-elected and solving the mystery of the attempt on your life. This really gets at one very specific example of the pop culture legacy of President Kennedy and the assassination, this ability to travel back through time and change November 22nd, 1963. This scenario has played out time and time again in books, TV shows, and feature films over the past several decades. One of the most creative examples is an episode of the 1985 revival of The Twilight Zone, in which a Harvard history professor from the distant future travels back to 1963 and ultimately sacrifices his own life in order to trade places with President Kennedy. Thus, the episode concludes with John F. Kennedy, alive and well, lecturing to a group of history students some 200 years in the future. And as we reach the end of this brief cultural journey, I'd like to bring us back full circle with this special edition G.I. Joe action figure from 2000, produced in cooperation with the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston. This Lieutenant Kennedy figure came equipped with a map, compass, knife, sunglasses, and dog tags. He also came with an oversized version of the coconut shell on which Kennedy had carved his SOS message after the sinking of PT-109. While it is extraordinary to see Kennedy as action hero at the dawn of the 21st century, it's not entirely surprising since his image has lingered in the national consciousness, whether it be the heroic story of PT-109, the idealized reimagining of his White House years as Camelot, a narrative carefully developed by Jackie Kennedy following the assassination, or of course the lingering questions that continue to surround his death. When I see this action figure, it always reminds me of some of the 1960 childhood recollections that form a substantial part of our ongoing oral history project. One in particular, a man who was only 4 years old at the time of the assassination. His earliest memory dates back to November 22nd, when he vividly recalls his mother going to a local variety store and buying him a PT-109 toy boat. She wanted her son to remember President Kennedy, and she forged a personal connection that day that he says has lasted his entire life. It's easy to imagine that same man at age 41 in 2000 buying his son this G.I. Joe. Affection for and admiration of President Kennedy seems to be passed down like a family heirloom, part of both a real and manufactured nostalgia, so that even those of us who were not alive when John Kennedy walked this earth feel like we knew him. We miss his presence in American politics. We hang his picture on the wall. We watch movies about his life and death, apply his old words to new social causes, and sometimes we just feel the need to buy our kids an action figure. Literally, just days ago, the grand masters of pop culture collectability, Funko Pop, released their John F. Kennedy vinyl figure. And fittingly, Considering that his 1963 Halloween costume was sold alongside Bugs Bunny and Spider-Man, Funko Pop JFK stands proud in an extensive collection of more than 8,000 pop culture icons that include superheroes, film and TV personalities, cartoon characters, and corporate mascots. I'm sharing this photo with you today because our figure has not yet arrived, although it is on its way. And it's a great place to end with this recognition that John F. Kennedy, man but equally myth, maintains a remarkable place in our global culture with a relevance that can still be felt today. If you, either here in the gallery or watching via YouTube, have examples of President Kennedy in popular culture from any of these time periods, we hope that you'll consider sharing your items with our museum as we continue to collect colorful and unique depictions of the life and legacy of President Kennedy. Thank you, folks, very much.